We've been asked to think about coal and coal's past and future and how coal is important or not in the Ukrainian context. I am extremely biased because I'm originally from Donetsk, and so my perceptions of hard coal and coal mining and the whole context is extremely coal saturated, I'm afraid, and so my perceptions of coal are really shaped by my background experience and growing up in the city of Donetsk. When I was a kid, we had 21 coal mines operating within the city limits. And that only includes city of Donetsk, excluding city of Makivka, which is effectively a conurbation in which there are other coal mines that were in operation. And of course, that's excluding the entire Donetsk coal basin. The coal field, I just put a map. I said I wouldn't have any slides, but I thought I have a couple. Just as a context, this map maps in the dark the central Donbas, the main sort of coal field. You can obviously understand that there is a bit of eastern Donbas going into the Rostov Oblast of the Russian Federation. Most of it goes to Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine, and there is a little bit one district in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is also part of the Western Donbas, and still quite indeed, quote unquote, profitable in terms of mining. So my experience is been by coal from the very beginning. My grandfather was, when the Soviets came back in 1943, he was grabbed from the street, and instead of sending him to the Red Army, they sent him to the pits. The Soviets decided and got a massive group of people that had to de-flood the mines that were flooded by the retreating German army, and they spent a couple of years doing really incredibly hard work of trying to recover the coal mining that has been part of the region's history since 1861. Donetsk was founded in 1861, famously by the Welsh industrialist from Merthyr Tydfil, John Hughes, who brought, of course, all his Southern Welsh mining company and started digging coal. And coal was the bread and butter, so to speak, of the Donbas economy until very recently. So I'd like just to mention the historical perspective of this. I was born in 1975, and that was the peak of coal production in the Donbas region. Ukrainian coal production, which is mostly dependent on the Donetsk coal fields, peaked in 1976 at 218 million tons of coal. You can see here from this graph how rapid the decline was from the peak of 75, 76. It lost already 13% of its output in the late 70s, early 80s. And then, of course, in 1989, the Soviet coal mining industry was struck by a massive industrial unrest, by the first strike in the sort of late Soviet history, the coal miners' strike of 1989 that hit the Kuzbas region in Siberia, Vorkuta, and of course the Donbas, the Donetsk coal field in eastern Ukraine. And you can see the sharp decline from 88 to Ukraine's independence. So coal mining has been declining really sharply as in terms of output, even those 3 years before independence. And you can see a similar sort of level of sharp dip until 1996, which is the sort of the bottom of this particular period, with which production collapsed from 192 million tons to just about 75 million tons of the old metric. There was in mid-1990s, there was a change of counting of coal, and so you can see the different lines, and then the orange line now is the current sort of accounting standard of normal ordinary coal. And you can see how the coal mining kind of recovered, and especially peaked in 2012 at almost 66 million tons. And of course, with the first Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine, the capture of around 2/3 of all areas, coal mining districts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, you can see how the coal mining on the government control areas declined by 2/3, and just before the current second invasion, the coal mining output of Ukraine was 24 million tons. So from 218 in 76 to just over 24 million tons, that is a 45-year trajectory of Ukrainian coal production. And I think we need to take that, obviously, that picture into account, the way we discuss the questions that Victoria and Sean have put forward. What is the future of coal, and how important it is for Ukraine's survival and energy security. I think a lot of speakers will add to my observations, but at the moment, coal production still continues. However, of course, the Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine is disrupting it every day. One of the most pleasant coal mining towns that I visited before the war was, of course, Vuhledar, which is now on the front line, a clean and fairly well looked after town. Pavlodar, of course, is another area which still is coal mining until now, and still producing coal, which is important for Ukraine's power generation. However, you've discussed through 5 series how the energy system of Ukraine has been hit badly by the war. And so I think for the moment, looking at the big picture of the future of the coal, I think of the coal industry and coal production, it's fair to say that in Ukrainian context, the issues of climate change and the dirty coal and its role in that are currently secondary for the purpose of energy generation, especially given that all other energy resources are imported, and of course gas and oil have been heavily Russian supplied. So the future of coal, I think, shouldn't be considered here very differently from other countries in the region. Of course, Poland probably is the best example in which coal still plays an important role in electricity generation, despite the fact that, of course, the European Union 2050 climate change goals will have a bearing on this evolution. So I think difficult to discuss the long-term future of coal industry in the Donbas now. However, I think in normal times and after the war is over, that discussion will continue. And of course, destruction of towns and cities that heavily depend on coal mining will have to be, we will have as social scientists, planners, geographers, economists, social scientists, will have to consider the reconstruction of those cities in a very different way from the heavy coal mining legacy that those cities have. I'll stop now and leave the floor for other people to contribute.
Actually, here I would like to introduce the question of heritage of coal and what kind of resources do we have to think and consider the aspects of like cultural aspects of coal extraction, and also which historical emotions and historical implications of ethics can we decipher from the collections which we currently have. So actually, I will limit my presentation to photographic heritage of the coal extraction in the Donbas. Actually, as was already said, I work at the Center for Urban History in Lviv, Ukraine, and just before the war, I mean in 2013, back then we started a project of digitalization of collections representing the aspects of landscape change caused by the effects of industrialization in the Eastern Europe, including both Russian Empire and Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and till like through the socialist era till today. And here I would like to invite you to explore our digitized collections, and especially those collections which we digitized and presented at our website, and especially coming from two projects. One is a book project already mentioned by Victoria, and another is a project on archiving post-industry, which was conducted in cooperation with the St. Andrews University and Victoria Donovan and other colleagues. And also here I would like to present just very briefly like main topics and insights about the ethics aspects of photographic heritage of coal. But also I would like to express my gratitude to the colleagues who participated in this project, especially to Pshenichny Audiovisual Archive in Kyiv and Mariupol Local History Museum, which unfortunately heavily suffered from Russian invasion and from missile and aviation strikes in Mariupol. And unfortunately, Mariupol Museum is like almost no longer exists. And I only maintain a very random kind of messaging with colleagues from Mariupol Museum, and I really pray and hope that they will soon find some solution for their personal situation. And of course, I can only express like my pain and kind of hope for the better for the situation in the city. And of course, it's also very important to remember that basically these collections which we digitized are somehow a very small portion of very rich collections possessed by this museum, and these collections once again unfortunately no longer exist because of the Russian invasion and actually heavy warfare in the city of Mariupol. And also our colleagues from Pokrovsk Historical Museum were very generous in sharing their collections representing coal mining as well. I really would like to express my gratitude because we have several thousand photographs from Pokrovsk, which is a really like a coal mining town, and we step by step we publicize them online. And also several museums which we managed to cooperate with, such as the Donetsk Regional Museum, which was actually relocated from Donetsk and was based in Kramatorsk, but once again very heavily affected by the war now. And also private photographic collections, which are especially important as a contrast to official press photography. And here I would like to introduce first the collection of Pshenichny Audiovisual Archive, which is purely kind of official propaganda representation of the coal mining topic. But I think these collections could be also read critically, and so many aspects of ethics can be asked on the basis of these collections. For example, here you can see the aspects of ecological thinking of the industrial era. And actually, Pshenichny Audiovisual Archive is very rich in this representation of like official staged Soviet and socialist time photography. And as you can see here, like this ethics of non-conflictual and harmonious coexistence of industry and human world was very much typical for the industrial era. And this metaphor of social harmony and ecological harmony and harmony with nature is very much representative for this era. But also what was very typical specifically for coal and less so for other types of energy in the Soviet period was of course idea of heroism and personal effort for coal extraction, and idea of a superhuman and kind of a new man was especially embodied in the image of a coal miner. Whereas, for example, oil extraction was more associated with welfare and individualism, as Alexander Etkind also showed. So here you can see how coal was also imagined as a very special mineral, which gives kind of heroic strength and almost mythical qualities to a personality, and actually coal mining was a very much kind of person-making experience for the people of the industrial era. And in the hierarchy of professions, the coal miner stood very, very high in the back then in those times. But also sometimes we have very rare examples of critical photography. For example, this photography showing exhaustion, which was generally untypical for the official photography. But also I think there's aspects of exhaustion of human energy, but also coal energy is something which is very interesting to explore through these very rare visual examples. But also aspects of migrant labor force was very important for coal mining, because in the Donbas, as well as in many other regions all over the world, the idea of melting pot was very widespread, and this mix of labor force from very different regions was really implemented. And also this idea of solidarity as being very typical for the coal. I think this is one of the most important aspects of coal heritage, is this idea of solidarity and mutual help caused by, or actually produced by these very dangerous underground conditions of work. And especially in Soviet context, you can see the idea of transnational or national solidarity between representatives of different ethnic groups, as you can see here on this photography, where people of different ethnic origin are represented. And once again, thinking about the war and conflict today and the aspects of like ethnic enemy making or image of the enemy as ethnicized image, I think it's something very, very new to this situation, because before the full-scale Russian invasion, I think the predominant narrative of the Donbas was actually a narrative of inter-ethnic solidarity and harmony. But also shame culture. I think it's very interesting to think about ethics also in terms of feelings of pain and exhaustion and shame. And some very rare photography which we collected also represent how, for example, culture of shock workers, so culture of extremely fast extraction of coal also produced this shame culture of the stragglers, for example. But also connectedness, and I think coal is, as well as other types of energy, are very important for your imagination of bigger communities. And I think in terms of Benedict Anderson's nation building, it's very important to keep in mind this idea of connections and the imagination through the energy connection. And here you can see through this photography, for example, how this transportation of coal and transportation of energy built imagined communities in this region, not only Soviet Union imagined community, but socialist camp in general, socialist camp as connected through the energy. And of course, images of care and paternalism are very special. And I think here also ethical issues of possession of the coal miners' bodies and imagination of collective body of a coal miner as being treated and taken care of by the state is extremely important. And just very briefly, I would like to address a very different collection, which is a Anatoly Tyshenko private collection from Myrnograd, which is also a company town, which represent actually the period of coal miner strikes already introduced by Vlad in the previous talk. And very interestingly, how this private collection representing not loyalty and kind of official press staged photography, but on the contrary, the heritage of protests, to which extent this collection also introduces the topics of solidarity, the topics of collective body, and the topics of imagined bigger communities. As you can see here, in the end of the 80s, coal miners already referred to the notions of God, Ukraine, and freedom as their slogans, so very different from official Soviet socialist narrative. And also they used some political imagery taken from the or brought by the independence movement Ruch of Ukraine. But also in a very interesting way, we can see here how the private collections represent also not only political messages and messages of solidarity in a bigger group, but also how they reach very private aims and aims of maintaining personal connections. And this private and family photography were very much also introduced into this political context and political movement. And I would like really to finish with this photography for you to and invite you to explore our collections further and to really think about these connections between political and personal, about gender relations and bigger imagined communities, and how private and official archives can be helpful in how we imagine our ethical stance to energy consumption and generation, and of course also to remember how important it is to protect heritage against the war, and really to think how can we contribute to this very like also difficult and maybe painful heritage. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be speaking after Vlad and Iryna, and hopefully we'll pick up on some of the threads, but maybe in a bit of a different direction. So I've really, you probably see this, I should take this away. I have really been kind of in my research thinking about military geologic extractivism and imperialism, and the way Donbas as the region has been forged and shaped through military geologic extractivism, or Donbas as we know it today, Donbas as Donetsk coal basin, which in itself, you know, is a colonial project and a project of extraction where the whole region is kind of constructed around the resource. And I've been particularly interested into the role of geology in the construction of the region and these narratives, and the construction of the idea of fossil, or what is classified as fossil. These are just some pictures of a piece of coal from the first industrial mine near Lysychansk. But as I was working on the region, and as you have seen very clearly, I think from the first part of Iryna's presentation on the official archives, the official narratives of Donbas either related to industrialization or the war, and these narratives are very masculine, and very much not inclusive of other narratives where the non-human presences in the region, and I'm interested in plants as well, or accounts by women, for example. And so what I've been trying to do is to kind of try to look at the alternative archives of different sorts, and the kind of archives of resistance. And in this way, also looking at, part of which was engaging with the process, what Iryna was talking about, and what I see this resistance to be considered a resource, where there's the region, and we see it now again repeating this imperial extractivism of, using the region now for a different role, as a kind of premise and reason for this absolutely unjust invasion and violence. But this resistance by people living in the region towards being considered a resource. Right. And when I started working in the region, I came across Mikhailo Kuleshev's amazing Shakhty Rudniki Donbas online archive, which Victoria Donovan will talk a bit about his artistic work. But one of the things that I came across, which really struck me, is a very big body of literature on paleobotany. And this is a completely different, purely visually and narrative-wise, literature that I saw on the region, which didn't include images of masculine heroic miners, or the kind of contrary binary photos of suffering that people experience because of the mines in the region. And I was very struck by this abundant kind of vegetal imagery. And I started to get interested in coal as an archive of industrialization, an archive that contains human memory of settling the region, colonizing the steppe, but also as an archive of other geological periods, because coal obviously contains vegetal parts. And how those narratives, so within different geological periods, are integrated into the contemporary narratives about the region. I'm losing my train of thought, sorry. I'm basing it on my chapter, but I'm trying to condense it. And so one of the books, for example, I came across, and I work quite a lot. Give me a second. Is Ископаемая флора среднего отдела каменноугольных отложений Donetskого бассейна, so it's by two paleobotanists. And as I was kind of getting deeper into this book, one thing that was really striking for me is, of course, seeing the toponyms such as Gorlovka or Debaltsevo, which in the current context for me of the war, which began in 2014, meant completely different thing. But also the kind of fragmentation of representation, the difficulty of reconstructing these different archives that paleobotany as a discipline constantly deals with, because it doesn't have, the plants have to be reconstructed. And one thing that I also got very interested in is this artist who was making illustration for the book. And I struggled to find his name. There was only one time he's mentioned. His name is Boromirsky. And as I dug deeper, I realized that he might have been the victim of Great Terror in '37, because the only information I could find on him is that there was an artist called Boromirsky who was executed in Oryol, and this is the town where Zaleski, one of the paleobotanists, set up the first paleobotany lab in the Soviet Union. And so all threads led to the fact that this artist was executed. And there's this kind of uncanny presence. In addition to that, this book is published in '39, and some of the toponyms here, so there would be Rudnichnaya station, which was later renamed as Ruchenkova station and located near Ruchenkova settlement. And in 1938, so exactly when the book appears, it became part of Donetsk, the time known as Stalina. But it's also well known outside Donetsk because of the state violence that took place there during the Great Terror in 1930s, 40s. Ruchenkova Pole became a place of mass killings and burial of thousands of political opponents. Some sources claim 40,000 people. And the mention of Rudnichnaya station in this paleobotanic description from 1938 has exposed for me the uncanny threads of the process of extracting and retrieving human and then more than human matter. And even though this process might not seem to be connected directly, they're kind of nevertheless linked by physical and temporal proximities and the very actions of burying and unearthing memories performed by the same political regime, right, at this time the Soviet regime. And at the moment when modern human life forms were dug out from the ground in the form of plant fossils that we see here, people were buried in mass with no traces of identification. And only in '88, '89, just before the collapse of the repressive apparatus of the Soviet state, the story of Ruchenkova Pole was uncovered. So reading this, looking at this book as this document through the lens of Great Terror, this book kind of presents an archive of extinction of plants, which in itself is uncanny if you think about fossils as an archive of extinction, but also a kind of straight sublimated archive of executions by the Soviet regime, which are not directly present in the book, but as you uncover them. And so I've been kind of interested in that, in fossils and in coal being this archive of extinction that allows you to talk about other extinctions or killings or murders that are happening, which is of course really irrelevant at the moment. And I've been looking at different narratives, which I'm not going to focus on at the moment, but one of the ways I engage with them as well is working with the books through arts, and looking at the role of fossils, but also what I'm very interested in is how do we classify something as a fossil fuel versus, for example, plant fossil, right? And for me, the distinction lies whether something is a resource. So these are just some of the examples of, so I'm interested in kind of non-human inscription and looking at these fossils as non-human inscription. So this is what I explore here, or looking at fragments and the lost narratives. And for me, it's also a metonymy of other lost narratives that we don't know about the region, the traces of which were not preserved. Or for example, I said looking at toponyms. So here it says Gorlovka or Horlivka, one of the towns currently or occupied since 2014. But also looking at other stories through narratives. As I said, that what I would consider stories of resistance, and quite often they're stories by women, as women, while women were really present during several periods of Soviet extraction of coal, their accounts eventually get lost quite often from being representative of the region. So they kind of featured in the periphery of mining history at the margin. And one of the stories, for example, that I would like to share is from quite a recent film from 2018 by Piotr Ermianowski, Hirczyce w Sadach, Masters in the Gardens, where a protagonist called Olena, she comes back to her home village in Donbas, which is occupied from the front line, and which is constantly under threat. And so she's just, the film features her walking around and remembering growing up in this place. In one of the narratives, she kind of looks at the slag heap in the distance and shares this memory of her childhood. And she says, I used to play with friends on the stockpiles. We would collect clay of all colors, yellow, red, blue, and black, and do crafts. And black clay, as you know, is the most radioactive one. It contains uranium. We would make clay dolls and play with them. My grandma saw us once and scolded us. And also we used to find fossilized algae and wonderful Druze crystals there. My yard was full of such stuff. I thought I'd become a geologist. I collected all that stuff. It makes me feel very sad now, the situation when landmines are everywhere. Fields have landmines, slag heaps of landmines. No one will demine them. Even if the war is over tomorrow, we will find landmines from World War II. We still find landmines from World War II. They'll be there forever. And of course, very sad to read it now, as we know, most of Ukraine is going to be covered in landmines, unfortunately. So what I'm interested in this memory of Olena, fossils are presented as archives of childhood. So not necessarily directly an archive of industrialization, kind of heroic past of Donbas, but of childhood, something very intimate, but also as the archives of the Carboniferous periods, of other geological eras. And she mourns the lost access to the man-made hills that shaped the land in the region. And the slag heaps themselves become the archives of industrialization, preserving radioactive clay and other waste. But this industrial waste is turned into a place for children's games, where narratives of other geological periods, industrialization, and childhood form entangled knots from which, just like clay, she molds her story. Memories of wars, past and present, World War II, and the current war are also archived by the slag heap, which contains the masculinity of industrial projects. And the resource-oriented thinking it executes. And this, what happened? Sorry, just being outside in the wind, messing my notes. And the danger of landmines, as is therefore rendered inaccessible. The war displaces Olena's village from a safe space to a place of peril. Yet despite past and ongoing violences, Olena's excavation of fossils remains first and foremost related to her childhood. In this, she is actively inscribing her own story onto the narrative of displacement and extraction, constructed around violence and destruction. The fossils become her own beautiful world made from wonderful druze crystals. Druzy потрясающие in Russian, she says. Olena values them because they inspire visions of different realities, of different worlds, right, whether past geological or her childhood worlds. In her memory, fossils are storytelling engines used for imagining and creating. And maybe I'll just share one more story, and then if you have space, I'll share the third, but maybe not. And this kind of playful dimension of childhood was something I discovered in other places, which was very surprising for me, and also because I didn't grow up in Donbas, probably. That's one of the reasons. So in 2015, when I was conducting interviews for Donbas Odyssey, one of the women, Svetlana, from the town of Snizhnaya, which is also has been occupied, shared this memory with me when I asked her, do you have any objects here that remind you of home? And she says, no, but I really want to get a piece of coal. I really want it for some reason. I just wanted for myself to keep it in a kind of jar. I keep intending to come back to a creative process to make something creative myself, maybe. And then she goes back to the map which she drew, and you can also see slag heaps here, for example, which she drew. Because Snizhnaya, it's snowflakes, right? Because Snizhnaya literally means snowflakes. There are always snowflakes in a slag heap. And ask her, and does have coal special meaning for you? And she doesn't come from a family, and for example, of miners, as she shared with me. Coal is for me a symbol of my home region. In Snizhnaya, there are many mines, and my childhood memories is when my grandma would scold us, don't go to Shurf. Then we couldn't get it. What was the Shurf? And it turned out it was an abandoned mine, and there was a shaft, which a mine, it was called a shurf, so you can fall into it, yes. It was covered, and there was an entrance, an old covered mine, and because tunnels remain, you could fall into them. We couldn't understand it, we were drawn to it, and it turned out that it was a mine shaft. We could have simply died, but still we were drawn to it. So for Svetlana, coal contains cultural memory of her hometown and region, which is a mine town, as well as intimate memories of her childhood again. The danger and post-industrial decay in her story are obscured by the language. The kids don't know what the word shurf means, and therefore cannot grasp how unsafe it is to go there. Indeed, shurf is not a word I, as the interviewer and an outsider to the region, knew either. Svetlana doesn't explain the meaning of it the first time she mentions it, and unless already familiar with the context, the listener learns the identification together with the children, obviously exploring the dangerous places just like them. Obliviously. Svetlana's narrative mode of a memory from a happy childhood provides an intimate and irreverent representation of the traditionally established forms of portraying post-industrial spaces, which either focus on the celebration of human achievement, especially Soviet photography of the 1920s and 30s, which Iryna presented, or criticize deprived conditions of mining settlements. Even though Svetlana's story could be read as an indirect comment on the decline of the coal industry and the challenges of post-industrial monotowns where old mines remain dangerously accessible even to children, the way she moves between the personal, the communal, the playful, and the dangerous destabilizes traditional representations of Donbas. By carving out a space for personal memories, Svetlana engages with canonical portrayals of industry, as well as instrumental and extractive approaches to coal as a fossil fuel, as a resource. And at the same time, she manages to subtly shift the focus to more subjective experiences, to her own memories. Strikingly, Svetlana's relationship to coal is the one of care. The affection with which her narrative treats both coal and the industry of the region encourages us to see them not only as resources to be extracted, but potentially as intimate archives, which possess non-capitalist and incalculable values. And of course, I'll come to Lyuba Yakimchuk's poetry, which probably everybody is familiar, especially since she was in St. Andrews recently. But her famous now classical collection, Abrikosy Donbasu, explores also the industrial narrative of Donbas. And if the region is canonically represented as one giant factory, in Yakimchuk's, this factory becomes domesticated as a familial space. And so Abrikosy Donbasu opens with a narrative, well, the whole collection opens with a narrative poem of the same name, which is divided in sections. And one of the first images of the poem is one of the fathers standing in a mine juxtaposed to Ukrainian flag. And you can read my terrible translation, but I'll read Ukrainian. Це не прапор, це стоїть у шахті по коліна у воді, мій тато. Його обличчя, як вугілля, із відтиском польового хвоща до потопного, роками розтоптане, море твердне сіллю, трава твердне вугіллям. So from the beginning, Yakimchuk carves out personal space within the narrative about mining in Donbas. And her story is not about a nation, it is about a father, yet the fact of mixing the two up suggests a metronymical relationship between them. Why does this father stand in water that reaches up to his knees? One cannot help wondering whether this image is a reference to the flooding of abandoned mines, a sign of the decline of the coal industry. Yakimchuk then compares her father's face to coal, where coal is presented as a fossil that contains memory of its own vegetal origin, right? A different kind of archive. So one way of interpreting Yakimchuk's poem is to read it as a problematization of the idea of miners and coal being seen as interchangeable resources within the extractivist system. Here, coal is not made into a resource, it's just only a fossil fuel. Instead, it is vibrating with human and more than human life. First and foremost, it carries knowledge. And yeah, there's this one last section of her, which I will not read the quote, but this kind of vision of it being a text and being a book that you can read and therefore being knowledge rather than resource, I think is very prominent in kind of subverting this dominant narratives of making everything a resource with a human or non-human. Yeah, and I'll stop here and hopefully